About 20 years ago, Philip Yancey had written a book called What's So Amazing About Grace. And he just started a small group Bible study called Vanishing Grace. And in the opening section of the video that he puts forward, he interviews a number of different people that will ask the question, so what do you think about Christianity? What do you think about Christians? What do you think about evangelical Christianity? And invariably the answers are quite harsh. Many of them would say that they are judgmental, that they are critical. It's more like a cult. It's not very flattering, the results and the answers that people are giving. So he asks the question, if we believe in grace and we think that grace is so amazing, why is that not being translated to the rest of the world? Why is there such a disconnect from what it seems that the church believes and what we talk about a lot, but for some reason it's simply not being expressed in a way that's being perceived by the rest of the world, that grace is so amazing? And so that's one of the challenges for us as a church, that I think we really struggle with expressing exactly what we believe has occurred during this season. We're celebrating Christmas season. We're celebrating the fact that Jesus came down to this earth to express His grace, His love, and to save mankind from their own sin. And yet it is being perceived by the world as something that's not full of grace at all. So we're going to be looking at a passage today from John chapter 8 that really talks about this tension that sometimes exists in the church, where the church can offer the safety of legalism, or are we going to enter into the risk of grace? And this is a tension that we have felt throughout the ages, throughout history, and I think that we as a church have often erred on either side throughout history. You can think about examples where there hasn't been any grace towards people, and we've dealt with them very harshly. And a lot of those things is what people remember, and that's what they can recall. But also the other side of that can be an abuse of grace, where everything is reduced to something that we all should tolerate because God has died for all of our sin, and so it doesn't really actually matter whether you've sinned or not. And so there's no sense of accountability, there's no sense of what it means to be a disciple for Christ, or this call to holiness doesn't really mean anything. And so both of those extremes are actually not good at all. That's really not what God has called us to. And so we're going to be looking at John chapter 8, which is a story about the woman caught in adultery. And he does something very surprising. The religious leaders bring this woman to Jesus, and they say, this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to follow the law, which says that she should be stoned, she should be killed? And Jesus surprises us with the answer. It was a very risky thing for him to do, but I believe that grace has always been a risky and dangerous business. Legalism tends to be so much easier. It's something that we tend to gravitate towards much more easily. I grew up in a church, a pretty conservative church, and at least in my mind as a child, I remember thinking to myself that I knew the lines, I knew the boundaries of what was good and what was bad, what would lead you to heaven and what would lead you to hell. And so, for example, smoking. If I saw somebody smoking, it was automatically assumed that that person was going to hell because they obviously couldn't be a Christian, that they're smoking, right? Or dancing or going to movies. And there's all these rules, these guidelines, these boundaries that I had in my mind that were clear to me. Either you're in or you're out based upon your behavior. And I've come a long ways from that today, because I understand now that grace is a big part of what Jesus expressed to us. But there's a risk involved in that. There's this grace abuse that we can also have. So the challenge is, are we going to be safe and go with the boundaries and the lines? Are we going to feel better about focusing on the legalism and the boundaries that we can safely say that this person is clearly outside the lines of what God intends? Or are we going to offer the grace that God has given to us? And so this present represents the grace of God, and these stones here represent the legalism that is often presented in the church body. So let's look at the passage in John chapter 8. It says this: "Early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and Pharisees brought a woman they had caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. 'Teacher,' they said to Jesus, 'this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?' They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up and said, 'All right, stone her. But let those who have never sinned throw the first stones.' Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to her, 'Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?' 'No, Lord,' she said. And Jesus said, 'Neither do I. Go and sin no more.'" So this is the text, and even the text itself is shrouded in mystery, because if you look in your Bibles, you might find a footnote that says that some of the earliest and most reliable manuscripts don't even include this story. And so that begs the question then, why is that the case? Why would some manuscripts not include it and others include it? Well, I think that part of the reason might be that this story is very it could really polarize our thinking. Some people are going to read this story and they're going to say, "I love this story. I love the way Jesus gave grace to this woman." But other people are going to say, "Hold on a second. What is Jesus actually doing here? Is he actually minimizing the seriousness of adultery? Is he just forgetting about what the law has to say?" And so some people are afraid that this is too risky, this is too dangerous to include this in the scriptures, because some people may interpret it that way. And so the question is this too dangerous and too risky to include in the manuscripts, or is it too beautiful to lose? And I'm of the opinion that I believe it is too beautiful to lose. And I think that's one of the reasons why some of the scribes might have decided to include it and others decided to not include it. So let's look at the characters of the story. First of all, we have the crowds, and the crowds were there. They were eager, they were curious, they wanted to know what Jesus had to say. They were following him around and listening to him as a teacher. And so they were there and they heard Jesus talk, but it was actually only a very short sentence that they heard of Jesus. But I suspect that they learned quite a bit about Jesus in that very short dialogue that he had on that day. Secondly, you have the Pharisees, and these are the scribes, the teachers of the law. These are the ones who are adhering to the law. And they were the ones that Jesus himself accused of being hypocrites, because they had such a hard yoke. They had a hard teaching, and they were demanding that people obey this strict obedience to the precise requirements of the law, when even they themselves couldn't do it. And so Jesus was reserved his harshest words, really, actually, for the Pharisees. And their attempt here was not to learn of Jesus. They were not here to listen to what he has to say or to know more about God. Their intent really was to try and trap him. And then there's this woman, the adulteress, right? The woman who was caught in the very act of adultery, and she was dragged there by the Pharisees and dropped there in front of the crowds in front of Jesus. And imagine what she must have been going through. Imagine the pain and the humiliation and the shame that she went through. Sure, she was guilty, it's true. She was caught in the act of adultery, so she wasn't an innocent person. But the way it's worded, it almost leads you to wonder whether she'd even had time to get dressed. She was caught in the very act and just brought into the presence of the crowd. Even if she wasn't physically exposed, I'm sure she was stripped of her dignity at that time. And she was a victim of really this hypocritical trap that the Pharisees were trying to set for Jesus. And finally, Jesus was there, right? Jesus was the merciful one, the grace-filled one. And what is Jesus going to do? How will he respond to this woman being placed in front of him? So the characters are there, the crowds, the Pharisees, the woman, Jesus, but actually there's one person that's missing. At least it's not mentioned, and that's the man that was part of this adulterous relationship. Where is he? And so that raises some question marks for us. So what's the trap? The trap that the Pharisees set for women. What they did is they arranged for this act to actually occur. That they undoubtedly arranged for a man to go into the situation and to have an affair with this woman, or to arrange for witnesses to be available to observe this affair to take place. And so they brought this woman before Jesus, and they tell Jesus, Moses commands that we are to stone the adulteress, the one who is caught in this act. So what are you going to do, Jesus? Well, if Jesus said, okay, go ahead and stone her, then he would lose his reputation with the crowds, because he has described and expressed mercy and grace. He has taken the side of the sinners. He has eaten with them. He has loved them. He has cared for them. He is described as a friend of sinners. And he has always stood against the religious leaders and their religiosity and their demands for strict obedience in all of their hypocrisy. And so this would be a real damaging blow, and the people, the crowds, would really question what's happening here. On the other hand, if he says don't stone her, then the crowds might interpret that as saying, well, adultery isn't that big of a deal. And you know what's written in the Old Testament? It's not really, that's not really the way it should be. And what it really should be is that we just give grace now to people, even those who commit adultery. And so he would then be setting himself against God and his laws, and so he would be in danger of being a lawbreaker. And of course that would be exactly what the teachers of the law would want to be able to catch him doing, because really it wasn't the woman that they were after, it was Jesus. So to complicate matters even further, there's another layer to this, and that is whether or not whether Jesus was going to side with Moses or to side with Rome. You see, what Moses said in his law was perfectly clear. You couldn't misinterpret what was said in the law. In Leviticus 20 verse 10 it says, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and adulteress must be put to death. So it's pretty clear. If you are caught in the act of adultery, it's a capital punishment. You are to be stoned to death. But what Rome had to say was equally clear. Rome says that the Jews had no authority to exercise capital punishment. They weren't allowed to stone somebody to death. And they didn't include adultery as a capital offense. And so there is that risk as well. So if Jesus said, no, don't stone her, then he would be obeying the Rome law, but disobeying the law of Moses. So that would be religiously dangerous for him to do that. But if he were to say, okay, stone her, then he would be obeying the law of Moses, but he would be ignoring the law of Rome, and that would be politically dangerous. So either way, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees were eager to catch Jesus doing something wrong and to condemn him for it. And so it really was a perfect trap. It was really well thought through. What's also important for us to note here is that the application of this law was actually very rare, because it was very strict, not because adultery was rare, but because there was a strict requirement that there had to be 2 or more witnesses that actually observed this act of adultery. It couldn't be surmised. It couldn't be, well, it's probably true. It actually had to be much more than that. It reminds me of this woman who was part of a church, and she was known to be a gossip. She would often talk about others, and people really didn't like talking to her as a result, because she was the self-appointed judge of the church's morals. But she got in trouble one day when she started accusing George, and George was a new member to the church, and she saw George's pickup truck parked in front of the only town's bar, and of course she assumed that George was drinking all night and came home drunk, and that's the kind of person he is. And so on a Sunday morning, in front of a group of people, she said, "I saw George's pickup truck in front of the bar." And we all know what happens when he's parked in front of a bar. And so George was there, and he was present, and he didn't say anything actually. He didn't defend himself, he didn't deny it. He just stared at her for a bit and then just walked away. And then later that evening, he quietly took his pickup truck and drove it in front of her house and parked it there all night long. So this is the problem with assuming and thinking that this is exactly what has happened. So the witnesses actually had to observe what was occurring, and so the application of this law was actually a rare situation. And so it actually helps us understand the degree to which the Pharisees were willing to go in order to try to trap Jesus. So they had secretly arranged this, and they had secretly observed this act of adultery in order to try to trap Jesus. That's really what it was all about. So what is the response of Jesus? How does he respond to this woman, to the situation? Should she be stoned or not? Is Jesus merciful, or is he law-abiding? Is he going to take the side of the law of Moses, or is he going to take the side of Rome? So how is he going to deal with this trap? So what does Jesus do? Well, first of all, he doesn't do anything. I mean, he just stoops down and starts writing in the sand and in the dirt there with his finger. What does he do? What is he? Is he doodling? Is he drawing a piece of art? Is he writing words? What is he doing? Well, the truth is we don't know. We don't know what he was doing, but a lot of people have surmised of what he might be doing. Some people think that he might be just buying some time to hear from his Father, to listen to the direction that his Father would have him go. Or maybe he's writing the law on the ground. He's letting his accusers, his enemies, know that he does know what the law says. Or maybe he's writing down the names of the unscrupulous witnesses, or maybe even the male adulterer in this story. Or perhaps he's writing a list of the sins of these religious leaders, like pride and lying and insincerity and so on. Or maybe he's just trying to distract the crowd from gazing upon this woman who may very well be half-dressed, and trying to prevent that shame from happening upon her. The truth is we don't know. We don't know what Jesus was writing there, but we do know that when Jesus stood up, he did know how to get out of this trap. Not only did he know how to get out of the trap, but he knew how to set the trap back upon those who were trying to trap him. Now, this is what Jesus says. He says, "If any of you is without sin, let him throw the first stone." And imagine the tenseness at that moment. I mean, it must have been incredible. The crowds were anxiously awaiting to see what was going to happen, because there was silence there. And the Pharisees, they were trying to figure out, what to do, like how to respond to that. And then you had the woman who was anxiously waiting to respond because her life was really in the balance in all of this. And Jesus was quiet, he was determined, he was confident and serious. And he was waiting for the response as well. And eventually it dawned on them that Jesus had actually walked away from the trap. And one by one, starting with the oldest and going to the youngest, presumably, the oldest realized that their life has been filled with examples of where they themselves have broken the law. And so they started walking away. And one by one, everyone was gone. So did he condemn or allow? Neither. Did Jesus contradict Moses or Rome? Neither. Did he lose his reputation as the merciful one or as the obedient one? Neither. Jesus simply walked away from the trap. So as these men were one by one walking away, all that was left there was the crowds observing this whole thing, and Jesus himself with a woman. And so Jesus says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And the woman says, "No one. At least not yet. Because the one standing is without sin." Jesus is there present, and he alone is the one who is worthy to pick up a stone and condemn this woman for what she has done. But Jesus did not come to condemn sinners. He came to save them. He came to bring God's grace, not God's judgment. But he came to give a new chance, a new start, a fresh start. And so Jesus says this, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So is that it? Is that all there is to it? Jesus can simply say, "I forgive you," and that's it? What about the capital crime? What about what she has done? Aren't there consequences to that sin? You know, there are consequences to sin. I mean, there are huge consequences to sin. Contrary to what sometimes we like to think, is that whatever we do in the privacy of our own home, in our own bedrooms or whatever, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, at least that's what we tell ourselves, then, what's the harm? But there are always consequences to our sin. Sin has serious consequences, and this is exactly what led Jesus to the cross. This is exactly what happened as a result of our sin. It cost the life of Jesus. And so the same people that were ready to stone this woman were the same people that were condemning Jesus to be crucified a few weeks later. So does sin have consequences? You bet it does. Jesus himself received all of the anger, all of the rejection, and all of the shame that was meant for this woman to experience and the consequences of her sin, but Jesus himself took upon the consequences of her sin. And not just her sin, but my sin and all of our sin. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn it, but to save it. John 3:17. So was she guilty? Yes, she was. And so are we. Jesus said, "Go and sin no more." And he says the same thing to us. But he adds the promise, "Neither do I condemn you." That's grace. That Jesus is not here to condemn us. He is here to save us. I don't know if there's a clearer way of talking about the gospel, the good news of what Jesus has come. John 3:16, God loved the world so much that he sent his only Son to take upon himself the punishment of the world, the punishment that we ourselves deserved. And he offers that to everyone. He offers that to the adulteress, to the adulterer, to the Pharisees, to the leaders to every one of us, to all of the sin that is in this world. Jesus offers to forgive us of our sins. So, who do you identify in this story? Do you identify with the crowds who are kind of distant and curious, and they're observing this from a distance, not really sure how to interpret all of this? Or are you like the Pharisees, the ones who were too ready to pick up the stones and ready to condemn, ready to punish, because sin needs to be punished, right? But they themselves found that the trap that they were trying to set for Jesus was actually a trap for themselves. Or do we identify with the woman, the one who sees that Jesus knew all about her, knew her sin, and Jesus has every right to cast the first stone, but instead she hears the words of grace from Jesus? I believe that our story can be like the woman's story, that we too can receive words of grace, that we can receive the gift that God has for us and not be condemned. And the important thing for us to remember is that we all need grace. Sometimes in our crazy mixed up world, we don't think that we need grace. When you talk to people on the street, or sometimes even in the church, sometimes if you ask them, do you know where you're going when you die? Are you going to heaven or not? And so many people say, well, yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm good enough. I'm sure I'll be going to heaven. Every once in a while you get somebody who says, no, I'm going straight to hell. But I think a lot of people would say that, yeah, I live a good life. And so sometimes we don't even understand the seriousness of our own sin. We don't understand the consequences of our own sin. And so that's really the first place for us to understand that we all need grace. We all need what Jesus has to offer. And in order for us to receive it, we can't receive it unless we know we need it. And we can't give it until we have received it. And that's really, really the point of this. But I know there's going to be some of you that will not really like this story. I know that this will be a challenge because this story is dangerous. I admit that. Maybe it's fine for Jesus to say, neither do I condemn you, to that woman. But what if the church started doing that? What if the church started to say to, like Glencairn Church, we started saying to the adulterers and to the homosexuals and to the drug abusers and to the sinners of every stripe, we just started condemning them. We just started saying, we don't condemn you. I mean, there are consequences to our sin. And we need to make sure that they are punished and that the law is upheld. We can't just discard the law, can we? I mean, if people no longer have to face the consequences for their sinful choices, what motivation is left to be faithful followers of Jesus? So I want to conclude by asking you to imagine something with me. We know that only a short time after Jesus spoke these words of grace to this woman, that there was a huge crowd of people that had gathered together, and they were all yelling out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And they were yelling it out to Jesus. They wanted Jesus to be killed. The very people that had celebrated Jesus before are now turning their backs upon him, and they were siding with his enemies. So I want you to imagine with me for a moment who might be in those crowd, who might be in the crowd, and yelling out, "Crucify him." Can you imagine that those who had observed Jesus' miracles would be in that crowd yelling that? Yeah, I can imagine that. Jesus performed his miracles in public all over the place, so it would be no surprise to me to know that people may have observed these incredible miracles and still been yelling for the death of Christ. Can you imagine that there'd be some people there who had heard him preach? Certainly. There'd be all kinds of people that heard him speak, crowds and crowds of people gathered around him to listen to him speak. But they rejected him not only as a miracle worker, but also as a preacher as well. How about those who had been called by Jesus to be a follower? Do you think they would be capable of saying, "Crucify him"? Well, if Judas who was a disciple of his and followed him for that time that he was here on this earth, betrayed him, then certainly there would be others that would be in that same category. Now, what about this woman who was caught in adultery? Do you think that she was there too? Can you imagine her just a few weeks after being told, "Neither do I condemn you"? Can you imagine that she would be in that crowd yelling for his condemnation? I cannot. I cannot imagine that. Because deep in my heart, and I believe deep in your heart too, we know that the most powerful way of drawing people to Jesus is not with miracles, it's not with sermons, it's not with calls to being faithful followers of Jesus, but the most powerful way of calling people is by sharing the incredible grace of Jesus. That's why I believe that pouring upon the people, the sinners in the world, pouring on God's grace was really Jesus' highest priority. And I think that should be the highest priority of the church as well. We all deserve judgment, every single one of us. But Jesus extended his grace to us. And a church that freely receives the grace of God needs also to pass it freely on to others, even for those who deserve it. Is this a dangerous story? Yeah, it is. And I know that there is an extreme on either end. There is this extreme of holding people to account to such a degree that we exact punishment upon them. There needs to be this adherence to the precise laws. And so this is what we're going to do to punish them. But there's also the abuse of grace, to go too far, in which we say it doesn't matter what we do. Your sin is all covered by the cross of Jesus, and so there's no accountability, there's no discipleship, there's no call to holiness. Neither of those are options. But I think we really need to understand deeply what it means to receive the grace of God, to know that we need it first of all, and then to receive it into our own lives so that we can give it to others. Jesus chose grace, and he still does. And we are invited to receive it and to give it on to others.